we are going to make sure that all the proceeds from our tariffs go back to support workers in the affected industries, so in the steel industry, in the aluminum industry, and any other industry that the Americans may affect. In addition, we will double down on the partnerships that we have with the industry. As you know, a lot of the big investments here have been in partnership with the federal government, with the Ontario government, the so-called SIF fund as one example. We are proud of what you have accomplished. It's a remarkably competitive company. It's a world leader who's going to be here for another 30 years, another 30 years after that, another 30 years after that. And I know there's multi-generations of workers here. And your children and your children's children will have opportunities to work at Dofasco and ArcelorMittal. Let me just say one other point, or make a couple other points with respect to the United States and the relationship there. We understand, I respect President Trump's concern for American workers and American families. We respect his concern about fentanyl. It's an issue for us here in Canada as well, and that's why the Canadian government moved very quickly with a comprehensive response that has had a huge impact in terms of controlling that issue and getting on top of that issue much better. We are ready to sit down with the Americans, with the U.S. government. I'm ready to sit down with President Trump at the appropriate time under a position where there's respect for Canadian sovereignty, and we're working for a common approach, a much more comprehensive approach for trade. We're all going to be better off. Workers here in Canada, which is our concern, workers in America, which is his concern. We are all going to be better off when the greatest economic and security partnership in the world is renewed, relaunched. That's possible. You have a new government, but the same commitment, and that commitment is built rock solid on the commitment you have all made here at Dofasco.
New tariffs are now in effect on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States as President Trump escalates his trade war. It's a move that threatens to drive up prices for Americans on a wide range of goods, from cars to appliances. But it comes as we're finally seeing stubborn inflation slowing down a bit, and there are concerns that Trump's sweeping policy could undo that progress. Already we're seeing swift retaliation. The European Union slapping duties of its own on billions of dollars worth of American products, and Canada firing back with a 25% levy that targets items from computers to sports equipment. All of this chaos and confusion rattling Wall Street, fueling fears of a possible recession, with economists at JPMorgan Chase saying they believe there is a roughly 40% chance now of an economic downturn this year. CNN's Jeff Zeleny is live for us now at the White House. Jeff, give us the very latest.
Well, Brianna, there's no doubt that the soundtrack of this administration, at least for the last week or so of the White House, has been the falling markets. It's really been accompanying the president's ongoing decisions, off again, on again, on the tariffs that he's imposing on Canada, on Mexico, on China, and of course coming up more on European allies. And that really was the basis of the backdrop of the conversation that the president had just a short time ago with the Prime Minister of Ireland, who is here at the White House. He's visiting Washington for a ceremonial visit marking St. Patrick's Day. It's always one to underscore the relations, but certainly these new tensions with the EU, these new trading tensions, imposing tariffs on very American things like Kentucky bourbon and motorcycles made in Wisconsin, Harley-Davidsons, are coming front and center here. But the president was defensive about all of his decisions and the uncertainty that's roiled the markets.
Let me just tell you the inconsistency. I have the right to adjust. And I was called by the automakers, as an example, General Motors, Ford, etc., the big three, the big four, and they asked me to do them a favor. Could I delay it for a period of 4 weeks so that they're not driven into a little bit of a disaster for them? They actually love what I'm doing, but they had a problem. And I'm not like a block that just, I won't delay. it's called flexibility. It's not called inconsistency. It's called flexibility.
But that flexibility also is seen by many as uncertainty, which has led to confusion in the markets in terms of business leaders trying to plan for the future. So, Brianna, the bottom line here is the market's still watching very carefully what this administration is doing, perhaps seeing a shorter game than the long game that he is talking about here. But he defended his moves as flexibility and said as president, that's what he can do and what he plans to do. Brianna.
Whatever the game, they're still trying to figure out how to play it, and that is the challenge. Jeff Zeleny live for us at the White House. Thank you.
Joining us now to discuss market turmoil, tariffs, and Trump's trade war is Neil Irwin, the chief economic correspondent for Axios. Neil, I want to start by asking you about something Trump touted in the Oval Office moments ago. He talked about inflation cooling. How do you read that in the middle of this escalating trade war?
Yeah, so this number we got today, the Consumer Price Index for February, what it shows is that this kind of elevated inflation we had at the end of last year, heading into January, looked to have been temporary. So the underlying inflationary dynamic in the economy is pretty benign. It's getting better. The question is what happens now? And February, we only had the earliest impact of the trade escalations and the trade wars, the tariffs. We don't know for sure how much those are going to affect prices and headline inflation in the months ahead, partly because we keep getting the stop and start action on exactly what's being implemented, how high, how broad it's going to be. So for now, the inflation picture looks pretty good. The question is what comes next?
And on the tariffs here, immediate retaliation from the EU overnight as more new steel and aluminum tariffs, broad tariffs, hit. You hear Trump saying the U.S. is going to react there, which appears to be putting us at risk of a global trade war there. He's trying to fix real or perceived trade imbalances. He's trying to goose, industrial manufacturing here in the U.S. Can he do that without it over time really costing the American consumer?
I think the real question here is how much is this going to be a one-off change in the kind of terms of trade with all of these major trading partners, and how much is it just going to be chaos and an ongoing on-again, off-again type of arrangement? If you talk to CEOs, they'll tell you, look, they don't want to pay tariffs, they don't want to have to reroute their supply chains, but if it's a one-time change, they know it's going to be in place, they'll adjust, and prices might go up in a one-time way. They might have to, raise their prices. They might have to take a hit to their profit margins, but they can live with it. What's harder to live with is kind of this policy changing every day in a way that makes it very hard to commit to things, to build a factory, to hire people. And so that's, I think, the open question. Do we find a new normal for trade policy between the U.S. and its major partners? Is that stable, or do we keep having the chaos we've had over the last month?
The counter argument from folks in the administration would be that these tariff threats yield results. They would point to the Ontario Premier, I believe, Premier, mm-hmm. Doug Ford, undoing his 25% surcharge on electrical imports into 3 U.S. states as a result of Trump threatening to double steel and aluminum tariffs on Canada. They would point to that and say that's a success story. How do you read it?
Well, that's reversing a policy that was only retaliation for tariffs the U.S. put in place. This gets back to a fundamental question about Trump's trade policy. How much of this is about having a negotiating tool, a source of leverage, versus his other goals, which is resetting the entire framework of the global economy, redomesticating U.S. manufacturing, creating a revenue source for the federal government. Those things are in tension with using this as a negotiating ploy, using this for tactical advantage on whether it's fentanyl or trying to get very narrow gains from different countries. There's a tension between those, and the White House right now is trying to have it both ways. So we'll see which way it leans as this policy area goes forward.
Yeah, and it's hard to answer some of these questions because you don't know what is true today on tariffs, Neil, may not be true tomorrow. That makes it really difficult. But Americans have their point of view about how they're seeing this. 61% of Americans disapprove of how Trump is handling tariffs. 76% of Republicans, though, approve of the tariffs, but that's lower than their approval on all of the other categories that are polled. I wonder how much that public opinion, and certainly if it's persistent, could impact things.
Yeah, I think it could. And, the stock market, let's be clear, the stock market hasn't dropped all that much this last few weeks, but whenever it starts to move, it gets people's attention. And that's before you get to the price impact, the inflation impact. And, if the price of goods at Walmart starts to go up in the months ahead, we've seen what happens. We saw that in 2022. People really don't like it. And so, there really is a risk here for the White House that if they try and break things and move fast and take some chances with the economy, if people start seeing goods get more expensive, if they start seeing their stock portfolio drop, it will have a cost politically. We see that in the data already on surveys, and it's early days. We're 2 months into this administration, not even, and the kinds of things they're threatening on trade would involve much more expansive tariffs than we saw back in 2018, 2019, and would show up in terms of consumer prices, would show up in GDP growth, would show up in the job market, most likely.
All right, Neil Irwin, thank you so much for being with us.